Hello and welcome to this video on the idea of manspreading. Manspreading is generally considered the process of a male sitting down and having their legs spread wide. Generally it is about shoulder width or more apart. There is an asinine and rather pervasive opinion that it is both deliberate and a malicious behaviour. It is considered such a serious social issue that shares have been made to mitigate the problem. The problem with this view of manspreading as a social issue is one of a basic anatomical ignorance. Any topic that leads to a viral video of a woman supposedly splashing males with bleach must have something to it, right? Right? Yeah, probably not. The idea is in some ways comparable to someone putting their bag on a chair or similar, but where they have cognitive choices made as an impolite person, the other is a result of an anatomy with little to no physical control. Despite this, the Oxford Dictionary defines manspreading as such: the practice whereby a man, especially one travelling on public transport, adopts a sitting position with his legs wide apart, in such a way as to encroach on an adjacent seat or seats. With that in mind, let's look at the male body. Starting with the torso. The average man's shoulders are much wider than females. That is, they're about 28% wider than the male hips are, whereas the female shoulders are more in line. If a male sits down on a seat with their knees together, and they are in conjunction with others on, say, public transport, then there's a good chance that even if they can fit their hips on that seat, their shoulders will not fit in the same space. This means that regardless of what they're doing, they're taking up the same relative volume. That will not change if their knees are together or apart, and to be clear, the apart is going to be considerably more comfortable for a male. Now for the hips and abdomen, which Wikipedia has provided a nice summary of the muscle process to understand. The male will sit with their knees close together. When this happens, the top of the femur will pinch against the edge of the hip socket. This will cause a certain amount of strain. In order for that to happen, the muscles in the inner thigh have to be worked. That then leads to the fact that there will be outer thigh pulling. That outer thigh pulling creates tension across the leg. This travels up into the back where you can get full tension, and that holds the contraction in place. When these muscles are contracted, the legs come in closer together. That means you need to have used your skeletal muscles and have exercised yourself to bring them together. When you relax that contraction, the legs will move apart to somewhere around the 40 centimeter mark. That is from knee to knee. That is the natural relaxed state of the male body, considerably wider apart. Then we need to consider that the male body, and specifically the male to female body, have very distinct differences in the bone structure. Females have a wider pelvis, and their thigh bones sit at a naturally wider angle towards the center of the midline of the body. This is different to the male. The male legs sit further away from that midline. That means that with their knees close together, you're going to find that their knees are, if they are in a relaxed state, wider away from each other than the female body. If we go into more detail, we can look at the impact of excess pressure on the pelvis, and specifically the external genitalia. Anyone with an iota of knowledge about the difference between males and females will know that males have external genitals. These hang outside the body. They can either rise or fall slightly with external temperature. As the temperature goes up, the testicles hang lower, and as the temperature gets colder, they retract towards the pelvis. This means at different times the testicles will sit more or less into the cavity between the male thighs. This will make it harder to squeeze the thighs together at different times. Consider the warm environment of packed public transport. Closing the gap between the thighs by squeezing the legs closer together will put uncomfortable, if not painful, pressure onto the testicles. Going from the hips down, we can look at the average angle of the legs, and specifically we can talk about some of the bone structure differences. We've already spoken about the skeletal muscular system and how it holds the legs closed and open depending on muscle tone. What we've not discussed is the angle of the hip joint itself. When you look at the muscle tone, that is distinct and separate from the way the skeleton is set up. The muscles help to use the skeleton as a point from which they lever the rest of the body, the skeleton being relatively solid. This means that a lot of the muscle functions can also be examined separately and distinctly from the skeleton, with the skeleton already having contributed significantly, and the skeletal muscle in particular, amplifying these differences. The male has an average angle of 12 degrees from the center line to where the knee bone comes out, while females have an average of 16 to 20 degrees. That is a 1.66 greater angle ratio for females to males. This is the angle pointing towards the midline of the body, which makes the legs spread less. Females with a greater ratio have their legs pointing more in towards that midline than the males do. While the facts are straightforward, there is one more minor issue. There is an argument that can be made that form follows function, or in this case, adaptations in the body. That is, the male hip is narrower and legs sit wider due to the habit of spreading legs. The only catch with this is that in cultures where manspreading is not common, you will see the same anatomical changes as are present in the skeleton for those cultures that have manspreading. That means the basic skeletal argument is sound, even if other arguments are not as reliable. For this video, we've not touched on the shrinking size of seats either, but this is a point worth considering for larger males. And it's certainly not an anatomical feature, but it's worth keeping in the back of your head when examining these arguments. Smaller seats will be more apparent with the male body than female. Consider the footprint of a chair. If you have a larger person occupying that chair, they may take up a larger space or volume of space than a smaller person would. Males being larger than females on average, you can see how this would eventually and inevitably lead to a male taking up more space than a single chair allows for when their male body is significantly larger than the female body. Ultimately, it seems to be a pointless and almost ignorant argument in many cases that is being made about this. Thankfully, no one has really endorsed that ridiculous chair yet. That could cause some serious discomfort if it ever became mainstream. If you want to understand the problems in practice, try walking around with a tennis ball squeezed between your thighs and see how comfortable it is and how long you last. That is fundamentally what is being asked of men if they are travelling long periods on public transport with their legs squeezed tightly together. The only difference is the tennis ball is replaced by something rather more personal. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.